Welcome to Harrow Super Sharing for Sunday, June 20th. We're delighted to have Karen Froman as our guest presenter today. Karen has been a valued advisor as we create new reconciliation gardens at Harrow United Church.
I know it was in touch with you to talk to you about this, so maybe Susan could kind of kick us off with a bit of an introduction, and then I can pay attention to anybody else coming into the meeting.
Okay. Well, I have known Karen since she was 4 years old. And when she started kindergarten, she would spend the afternoons with me. So we make lots of cookies and stuff. So I've known her for a while. And her love of gardening comes honestly because Dorothy loves to garden and preserve as well. And Karen is now teaching at the U of W history and focusing on Indigenous studies. And her son Logan, who has been very graciously helping me put the garden in and doing a great job, took green space horticulture at Red River. So we got 3 generations of people that love to plant and garden and everything. So that's wonderful. And I think Dorothy would like to do some bragging before Karen starts.
I certainly do want to do some bragging. On Friday, Karen pushed the submit button on her dissertation. And so it's been approved by her committee, and it's gone off to Faculty of Graduate Studies. So the only thing left is the oral defense, and she'll go through that like crazy. So as a mom, I'm so proud. This has been a long haul. She started it as a single mother with small children, and so has gone through the bachelor's degree, the master's degree, and now the doctoral degree. She's going to be Dr. Froman in a few months, which is just
very good.
Crazy. Her dad would be so happy. And I just wanted to say that one of the things that made me feel really good was Nagan Sinclair, who's, we all know, writes a beautiful column in the Free Press, was on her committee, and he had so many positive comments about her dissertation. And the title of it is The White Man's Camera, the National Film Board of Canada and Representation of Indigenous Peoples in Post-War Canada. And it's, I was the proofreader, and I'm just so proud of her. You just have no idea.
Wow.
So go for it, Karen.
So Sigo, Skanaganoga, Karen Jutes. I am Kanyen'kehà from Six Nations. I am also of Irish, English, and Dutch ancestry. Hi, Ma. Obviously, I clearly take after the European ancestry. So I was asked to talk to you guys today about the medicinal and the native plants that you put in at the church. In terms of kind of plants and stuff like that, all Indigenous peoples see the plant world as sacred and as being connected to us. All the worlds are connected, right? I'm sure some of you may have heard the term all our relations or all my relations. Okay. Yeah, and that's basically what it means, is that, as humans, we are connected to each other as living beings, as well as to all the plants, the animals, the air, and the water, because these are all living beings as well as the earth. So we don't see things like rocks, for example, as inanimate objects, right? The rocks, the mountains, the very earth itself is animate and alive, and needs to be respected and seen as that, right? Because everything is part of creation, right? So as everything is part of creation as well as us, right? We do not stand above, right? We're, a circular part of it, right? So that's kind of the way we look at things. And being Kanyen'kehà, the English word is Mohawk, okay? and Haudenosaunee. The English word is Iroquois. Okay, the plant world is really important to us. We were an agricultural and are, to a large degree, still an agricultural people. The corn, beans, and squash were incredibly important to us. We called them the Three Sisters. Planted together, they support each other, right? You plant the corn in the middle and the beans around the corn. The beans grow up the corn supports the beans bring in the nitrogen, which the corn sucks up, and the squashes are planted on the outside, and those keep the moisture in and the weeds down because the leaves are really big, right? And of course, we've all planted various squashes, and they tend to be kind of prickly, right? So that also keeps the critters out, right? Keeps them from eating your garden. So yeah, I've always been a gardener, right? Thanks to Mom. My dad's family, on the other hand, right? Even though it's, we're an agricultural people on my father's side, as children, my dad and his siblings, so my aunties, they had no choice but to work as itinerant farm laborers in the 1940s and the 1950s. And this was very, very hard work, right? They got around Southern Ontario by horse and buggy, okay, in a wagon, going from farm to farm, basically, picking strawberries for 25 cents a bushel. So very hard, very brutal, exploitive labor. So my dad was, meh about the garden, right? He didn't really care. And most of my aunts, particularly my Aunt Violet, my dad's oldest sister, she thinks I'm completely insane. But I mean, I get it. It's from their own, their own childhood, traumatizing childhood experiences. I'm not sure if Mom's ever mentioned it to any of you, but Dad was a survivor of the Mohawk Residential School. It's known as the Mohawk Institute. It's the oldest residential school in Canada. It ran from 1830 to 1970 and was operated by the Anglican Church, the Church of England. So he attended that place for 2 years, and his younger siblings were all there for a number of years longer. But in terms of the plants that Susan bought and that she planted with the help of my son, I want to start off with tobacco, because tobacco is the first plant that Creator gave to us as Indigenous peoples, and it's the main activator of all the plant spirits. Okay, the three other plants, main plants, right? Sage, cedar, and sweetgrass. Follow tobacco, and together these four are what we call the four sacred medicines. Okay? And these four sacred medicines are used in everyday life and in ceremonies pretty much right across Turtle Island. The specifics are different, from nation to nation, of course, right? Because we're not all the same, right? But all four of these medicines can be used to smudge with. Although sage, cedar, and sweetgrass also have many other uses. Okay? It's said that tobacco sits in the eastern door, sweetgrass sits in the southern door, sage in the western, and cedar in the northern door. And elders say that the spirits like the aroma that's produced when we burn tobacco and the other sacred medicines. And so traditional people and elders will say that tobacco is always first. It's used as an offering for everything, and it's used in every ceremony. The saying is, always through tobacco is what the saying is. And traditional tobacco was given to us so that we can communicate with the spirit world. Burning tobacco opens the door that allows that communication with the spirit world to take place. So when we make an offering of tobacco, we're communicating our thoughts and our feelings through the tobacco as we pray for ourselves, for our family, our relatives, and others. Okay. And as mentioned, tobacco has a special relationship to the other plants. It's the main activator of all the spirit plants. It's kind of like the key to the ignition of your car, right? When you can think of it that way. So when you use tobacco, all things begin to happen. Okay, and tobacco is always offered before picking medicines. Okay, so when you offer tobacco to a plant and you explain to the plant why you're there, that plant will let all the other plants in the area know why you're coming to pick them. Okay. And also when you seek the help or advice of an elder, a healer, or a medicine person, and you give your offering of tobacco, they then know that a request being made with that offering of tobacco is a sacred request, right? So somebody like me, right, I don't need such an offering, right, because I'm no elder, I'm no medicine person, right, I'm just a historian, right? But that's how we express our gratitude, right, for the help that the spirits give us, right, is through that offering of tobacco. It's put down as an offering of thanks to the first family, to the first people, to the natural world, and often also after a fast, right? Traditional people will also make an offering of tobacco every day when the sun comes up. I am not a morning person, so yeah, I'm not into. Yeah, I don't go that far, right? Because I cannot remember the last time I saw the sun come up. And traditional tobacco is still grown in some communities. So, for example, my father's home community of Six Nations still grows traditional Kanyen'kehà tobacco that they grow themselves and is very sacred to them. And this is the type of tobacco that I grow in my own garden, is Six Nations tobacco. So yeah, I mean, maybe next year I'll give you guys some of it. So the next plants that come after tobacco are the sages. Okay? There's two main sage. Well, there's lots of different sages, but the two main sages and the ones that we planted are white sage and prairie sage. And depending on the culture, right, depending on the nation that we're talking about, and the region of Turtle Island that we're talking about, sage can be used in medicine pouches, spread over the floor of a sweat lodge, wrapped around sacred implements, used for healing, used to make bad spirits sick. It's used to purify people and dwelling places. It's used to heal. It's used to calm, right? There's all sorts of uses for it. And there's two main types of sage, each with their own distinct qualities and uses. So white sage, for example, is used for the purification of mind, body, and spirits, as well as to purify sacred articles in advance of prayers and ceremonies. So sometimes when you go to ceremony or Sundance, you'll often see the elder smudging his implements and the drum, right, before they use it, right? That's what they're doing, right? They're cleansing everything, right? And in some areas, in some communities, white sage smoke is also believed to provide a barrier that prevents negative spirits from entering the room in which the ceremony is being held. Prairie sage, which is what most of us are familiar with, right? The big tall stuff that grows everywhere, is also very important ceremonial. It's used in sweat lodges, and it's also very important for the Sundance, which is fairly common out here on prairies. Okay? Prairie sage is also considered to be highly medicinal. Okay? It's used by Indigenous peoples for foot baths, kidney and bladder infections. You can make a tea for a sore throat gargle. And you can also drink the tea to use for intestinal worms. Okay? The leaves can be rubbed on the skin as an insect repellent. The boiled leaves can be used as a poultice to treat skin problems, including mild burns. Okay? Chewing the leaves also works as a breath freshener. Okay? And it's also believed that chewing the leaves brings good luck. So sometimes prairie sage is called bingo medicine. Right? No, the first time an elder told me that, man, I just about cracked right up. I thought that was hilarious. Like, bingo medicine, right on. So yeah, so if you want to go play bingo and you want some like choose some prairie sage before you go. So the next plant that comes after the sage, after the tobacco and the sage is the cedar, right? So we've planted white cedar, okay? So like sage and sweetgrass, cedar is used to purify the home as part of a smudge. Okay, and now when cedar is put into the fire with tobacco, it crackles. Has anybody ever tossed dried cedar into a fire? Right, you get that crackle and all the sparks. Yeah. So when it does this, what it's doing is it's calling the attention, excuse me, of the spirits to the offering that's being made. Right, so it's letting the spirits know that there's an offering about to come. Right? Cedar is also used in fasting and in sweat lodge ceremonies as a form of protection. So cedar branches will cover the floor of the sweat lodge, and a circle of cedar will surround the lodge of the person doing their fast. Okay? Cedar baths are also very healing. Okay? And cedar has several other medicinal uses as well. The crushed leaves can be crushed up and mixed with other herbs, boiled, and then used as a wash in a drink to treat what's called the twisted face caused by stroke. Okay? So these are all traditional uses. Okay? The drink can also be used to treat bladder problems such as urine retention, and it was also used to treat pneumonia. Okay? As well, the dried and powdered leaves can be mixed with other ground plants and a bit of water to make a paste that's used as a poultice for pain treatment. Okay? So yeah, there was all sorts of traditional medicinal uses for cedar as well. Sweetgrass, okay, again, something that grows all over the place around here, has slightly different significance in different communities depending on where you are. Okay, so to the Anishinaabe, for example, right, so the Ojibwe, it's believed to be the sacred hair of Mother Earth, and so it's often braided. Right, so the 3 sections of braided sweetgrass represent the mind, body, and the soul. Okay, in other First Nations, right, the 3 sections are seen to represent love, kindness, and honesty. Okay? In either case, positive messages. Okay, and our sacred traditions in all Indigenous cultures, or it doesn't matter where on Turtle Island we are, teach us that when you take something from the earth, so when you're picking sweetgrass, for example, then an explanation to the spirits of that plant about why it's being picked and how it's going to be used is required. Okay, and as mentioned earlier, right, this explanation is usually accompanied by an offering of tobacco in return for the generosity shown by the earth and the plant that's sharing itself so that we may live, right, and have good medicine. Okay. Sweetgrass is used in smudges, in healing, and in talking circles because it has a healing effect. The smoke of sweetgrass is believed to purify our thoughts, the environment, and to eliminate bad or negative thoughts from our mind before we enter into ceremony. So it's usually braided, then dried, and then burned. Okay? And it's usually burned at the beginning of a prayer or ceremony to attract positive energies and to negate those negative ones. Okay, and of course, it's also known for its very sweet smell, which is intensified when it rains, right? Or if you're out in the bush and it's wet and you stomp on it, you get that really nice smell. Or of course, when you burn it, right? So, some people think it smells like weed, and people who think it smells like weed don't know what weed smells like. Okay? The best time to harvest sweetgrass is in late June to early July, so right around now. Okay, is the best time to harvest it. Okay, never pick it by pulling the stems. Okay, because that's going to damage the root system. Right. You don't want to do that, right? Because you want it to be able to come back. Right. Same thing with picking sage. Right. You want to cut it. You cut the stems fairly low to the ground. Okay. Never take more than you need. Okay, that's completely unacceptable. Okay. And doing damage to the clump during harvest is also not cool. Okay. The best way to dry sweetgrass is to just lay it out into the sun for about 6 hours. Okay, and then once it's thoroughly dried, it can be used for braiding for ceremonial purposes and ceremonial uses, and it can also be used in basket making to make really nice scented baskets. So sweetgrass has got all sorts of uses. So those are the 4 big ones that we planted, the 4 main medicines that we've planted. We've also planted a number of other plants in the garden that are both native prairie plants, so things that you would expect to find in Manitoba. And some of them actually have medicinal uses as well, traditionally. Okay, so Kanyen'kehà is another one that we've planted. It's a low-growing kind of a bush plant. It's also known as Bearberry. Okay, and Kanyen'kehà has both medicinal and food uses. Okay. So traditionally, we would use Kanyen'kehà in terms of food uses. The fruits are edible. They're kind of mealy and dry, right? But they can be cooked with lard and along with other foods. The leaves can also be dried and added to tobacco or used in place of tobacco. And Kanyen'kehà, in the Algonquian languages, so Cree, Ojibwe, for example, actually means mixture. Okay, and it's used to refer to a number of plants that can be used as tobacco extenders, such as Kanyen'kehà. Some of the other plants that we've done is aster, okay? And most people think of asters as a little more than, you know, really pretty wildflowers, but they may also have some medicinal uses to treat pink eye, or the roots can be ground up and applied topically to stop bleeding on open cuts. Okay, so it's, you know, more than just a pretty wildflower. Goldenrod, okay, we also planted goldenrod, okay? And of course, right, goldenrod provides nectar for migrating butterflies and bees. It encourages these good pollinators to remain in the area and pollinate your crops, right? So plants like goldenrod and milkweeds would often be planted at the edges of our fields, right, to attract pollinators in, okay? Planting goldenrod near your vegetable gardens can also draw the bad bugs away from your vegetables, right? So it's a good thing to have, okay? So they attract the beneficial insects, right? Which may do away with damaging insects, okay, when they're approaching the other food source offers, okay? And goldenrod leaves and flowers are most often used medicinally in a tea-based supplement for improving urinary health and reducing inflammation. Okay? So it does have medicinal uses. Golden Alexander is another native wildflower that we planted, okay? And it's an important early source of pollen and nectar for bees and other insects, just because it's one of the first flowers to come up in the springtime. Okay. Medicinally, Indigenous peoples, we would use the pulverized root to treat sharp pain. A tea was made from the leaves and the flowers to treat various female problems. Okay. And the root was made into a poultice to use on inflammations and on skin sores. Okay. The root can also be made into a tea to reduce fever. Okay. Now, Golden Alexander, if you use it medicinally, you got to be really careful with it because it can cause photodermatitis because there's a xanthotoxin in the plants, right? But xanthotoxins are used to treat psoriasis and other skin problems, right? But like I said, it's best used with caution, right? If you're going to try it, right? I personally, I wouldn't try it just because I have sensitive skin, so you know, I wouldn't try it. But you know, it does have medicinal properties apparently. And in terms of edible uses, it's also edible. Okay, the flowers, okay, with the main stem removed, okay, are nice in a little tossed green salad. And you can also cook them up, right, in a similar manner to broccoli, right? So give it a little gentle steam, okay? So, and then the last big one that we planted is milkweed, okay? And, you know, as everybody knows, or I would imagine everybody knows, all varieties of milkweed are the only source of food for monarch butterflies, okay? And many of us think of it simply as a pretty plant that's good for the butterflies. And although milkweed is potentially poisonous, okay, the plant has been used for medicinal purposes as well. And actually, you know, the reality is that, you know, most of our medicines originally, you know, were sourced from poisonous plants, right? We've just, you know, figured out the chemicals and now we just synthesize them in labs, okay? So a lot of indigenous peoples applied milkweed sap to warts for wart removal. Okay, they would chew the roots to treat dysentery. Okay, roots were also used in salves and infusions to treat swellings, rashes, coughs, fevers, and asthma. And milkweed was also even added to dishes to add flavor and to thicken soups. But of course, you had to take pretty special care in the preparation of the plants to avoid the toxicity that is in milkweed. So yeah, you know, there was, you know, you would think that, you know, there's no use for a lot of these plants, but there actually are. So yeah, so that's kind of the main plants that we planted. The ceremonial, the spiritual, and the medicinal uses that we have for these plants. Some of these plants are still used by traditional medicine people. Okay. I myself don't use these plants for those kinds of medical purposes, just because I'm not familiar enough with what I'm doing. I do grow some of them, right? But mainly to attract the pollinators and the butterflies and the bees. So yeah, so that's pretty much all I have to say. Does anybody have any questions?
Karen, is sage, like I've got a pot of sage growing on my back porch that I'm going to use in stuffing and things like that. Is that the kind of sage that you would be talking about, or would it be
Yeah,
something?
probably that would be the white sage.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you can use like the big tall prairie sage in cooking, but it doesn't have as much flavor, right, as the white sage.
Okay.
Right, but yeah, both white sage and prairie sage were used in cooking to add flavor, but the prairie sage was more ceremonial, medicinal, right? But yeah, the white sage can totally be used fresh, dried, whatever. Yeah, I got some dried prairie sage. I'll show you what it looks like dried. So the big tall stuff, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right, and a lot
Well,
of times, when you see the stuff, it'll be kind of bundled up and wrapped up, right, in a smudge. Right, and then you just burn that. This is also if you throw it on your campfire, it helps keep the mosquitoes away.
Okay.
Right, so like I mentioned earlier, the fresh leaves, right, rubbed on your skin, right, will help keep the mosquitoes away, and then the dried or the fresh, right, throw it on your fire. It helps make a smudge that the mosquitoes don't like. So, plus, it smells lovely, right?
Yes.
Win, 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 right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I have tons of it growing in my yard. It's just massive amounts of sage growing in my yard, and cedar, right, and tobacco, right? I've got a yard full of medicine.
I should have talked to you sooner. I planted some corn and some squash, but I didn't get the configuration.
Oh,
Next time.
I don't really plant mine in that configuration either, mainly because I don't have the kind of appropriate space, right? So kind of how and plus I've got a squirrel problem. So essentially how I plant mine is all my garden beds are fenced to try and keep the squirrels and the bunnies and all the critters out. So I've got my corn in the center, because it's rectangular shaped. So I've got my corn in the center. I've got beans on 4 sides, and then on one end is where I put my pumpkins. Right, so they're not really going to grow up and support each other, right? Because I've got everything trellised, but they're all in the same bed together, right? So, like traditionally, how we would do it out in the fields, right, is we would just scrape up a little mound of earth, right? We didn't dig, we didn't furrow, okay? Because we didn't have draft animals, right? We're doing this all by hand, right? This is women's work. So we would just use our hose to scrape up the soil into a little mound, okay? And then the corn would go on the top of the mound, and then the beans around it, and then the squash on the bottom, right? But you need a lot of space to be able to grow it like that, right? Because I'm sure we've all grown squashes, we've all grown at least zucchini. We all know that it takes over.
Yes. Very much.
Right. So yeah, so to plant it in that kind of traditional mound form, you need a fairly significant amount of space. Lovely squashes. Has anybody ever had the problem with your squashes or your pumpkins forming and then suddenly dropping off the vine?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to explain that. That's lack of pollination. They didn't get pollinated quite enough. Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, so what you need to do is you need to get up at the crack of dawn, okay? Because the squash flowers, right, whether it's a zucchini or a pumpkin or whatever, they're going to have 2 different flowers. They're going to have the male flower and the female flower. It's pretty obvious, okay?
Right.
Right? Which is which, all right? So go out first thing in the morning, because the female flowers will close up really early, and the male flowers tend to stay open for most of the day, okay? So first thing in the morning, go out with a paintbrush, scoop up a bunch of the pollen off the male flowers, and then dump it onto the female flowers, into the middle of the female flowers. Yeah, and then you got a way better chance that your pumpkins and your zucchinis and your squashes are going to actually set, right, and produce good sized fruits. Right, but yeah, I mean, the corn beans and squashes, our archaeological evidence indicates that the Haudenosaunee, my father's people, about 70% of our diet came from what we grew. Okay, we lived in permanent villages, of up to 2,000 people, right? So imagine that, right? I mean, how much land do you need to have under cultivation to feed a population of 2,000 people?
Lots.
Lots, right? A couple hundred acres at least, right? Yeah, right. So our villages, right, would be surrounded by, several hundred acres of cultivated fields, okay, interspersed with forest, okay, and the forests that we planted in the eastern part of North America, it was not a wild forest, right? This was not wild, untouched, virgin land when Europeans arrived here. It was a very carefully, deliberately managed forest agricultural ecosystem. We had deliberately planted and managed trees that bore fruit and nuts, right? When Europeans first arrived and they were walking along the paths through the forest in the eastern part of North America, they were amazed that along the edges of the path were all these fruit bushes. And they thought it was no offense, right? But they thought it was a miracle from God that these plants were magically there. In reality, my ancestors had deliberately planted them there and had deliberately managed that forest, right, in order to produce these kinds of foods, right? Same thing out here on the prairies, right? The prairies were not an untouched wilderness. The landscape out here was very carefully and very deliberately managed. And people farmed out here too, believe it or not. Okay, right. Again, we've got this idea that people on the prairies were just these nomadic wanderers wandering aimlessly looking for buffalo. No, right? People were farming, particularly in the river valleys. There's archaeological evidence of it both at the forks and up in Lockports. Okay, prior to European contact. Okay, and the land was deliberately managed through fire. Okay, prairie fires would be deliberately set at certain times of the year. What this does is it burns off the old growth. It burns off the young trees that are coming in. It encourages young new grass to grow, which brings in the bison. Okay, it's good for everybody, right? It keeps the ecosystem going. It brings in the bison, stirs up the ground, better things grow, right? So again, it was a very carefully, deliberately managed ecosystem, okay? Same thing on the West Coast, right? Again, a very deliberately, carefully managed ecosystem.
Karen, could you talk about the significance of smudging, and granting that we would ask an Indigenous person to lead it, but what, for instance, of the plants that you've talked about are involved in?
Well, generally in a smudge, you're going to get all four, right? So most smudges will have all four of the medicines in it. And basically the point of a smudge, right, before whatever, right, is to clear your minds and the space that you're in of negative thoughts and negative energy, right? So when we're doing a smudge, right, you'll often see it in the smudge bowl coming around, right? And you'll see people taking the smoke and doing this, right? So what you're doing with the smoke is you're brushing it over your head. And as you're doing that, you're brushing the negative thoughts out of your head, okay? And then you'll brush it over your eyes so you can see clearly. And then you brush the smoke over your ears so you can listen clearly. Okay, so that's often why you'll see us Indigenous people, when we're smudging, we'll do this. Okay, you'll see us do it 2 or 3 times. Okay, and we'll take our glasses off too. Like if we wear glasses, right, we'll take our glasses off and we'll smudge our glasses and then put our glasses back on. Right, So yeah, so we're clearing our minds, we're clearing our eyes, we're clearing our ears. So we can hear, so we can listen and see and hear with clear and good minds and hearts. That's what we're doing. That make sense?
Mhm.
That's pretty
Yeah.
simple, eh?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Karen, because there's been lots of concerns about cultural appropriation. I was just wondering, would a planting of an Indigenous medicine garden by a church ever be thought by some Indigenous people as being a form of cultural appropriation and not really be appropriate?
No, because I mean, I think you guys are making it pretty clear that this is an act of reconciliation,
Okay.
right?
I was just
Yes.
wondering, like, if some people might be insult, because there's seems to be such a lot of things that you got to be very careful what you do.
Yeah, what appropriation is taking things from Indigenous cultures and using, claiming, presenting them as your own. That's what appropriation is. Okay. So by
Okay.
planting a garden in the spirit and the intent that you have planted the garden is not appropriation. The point and the spirit and the intent of planting the garden is an act of reconciliation. Right? And I don't think right?
And we are going
Um,
to have some signs, like kind of explaining things, I think.
Yeah,
right?
right. So yeah, exactly, right? You know, I mean, you put up a little, it's a reconciliation garden, right? I don't think anybody's gonna have an issue with it. Right?
Actually, I like that
Yeah,
name.
nothing like that would happen.
And when it comes to Indigenous peoples, and again, this is something that often comes up in class, right, at university, because of course universities are expected to be secular, right? But I have to explain to my students that we cannot have conversations about Indigenous culture or Indigenous histories, right, no matter where we are in Turtle Island, without also having a conversation about Indigenous spirituality, right? Because everything in the Indigenous world is infused with spirituality, right? Every action, every thought is a spiritual action, is a spiritual thought. A really, really good book is by Blair Stonechild. Okay? Okay? It's called The Knowledge Seeker. Okay? Embracing Indigenous Spirituality, right? So it came out a while ago. I can't remember, probably about 3 or 4 years ago. But it's a really, really good book. Okay. Whoops. I don't want the forward. I want the cover. There we go. Oh, it's still doing that. Okay, anyway, The Knowledge Seeker, right? Blair Stonechild, right? It's Indigenous spirituality. Basically, it's kind of like his life story. Okay. But yeah, I mean, it's a really, really well-written book to kind of help wrap your head around, the notions of Indigenous spirituality. I mean, he's Cree, right? Right. So it's, fairly regionally specific, right? But, I mean, it's Cree, right? So it is applicable to us here on the prairies in Manitoba. Right? So he's Plains Cree from Saskatchewan. So that's a good one.
I can
as well.
highly recommend it. I read it.
Yeah. Other books that I can recommend with A Knock on the Door, The Essential History of Residential Schools in Canada, written by Amy Kraft and the TRC. That one came out again, I think 2014, a while ago. But it's a short little book. It's easy to read, right? It's written for Joe Average Canadian to help Joe Average Canadian understand the history, right? I do use it as a textbook in my history of residential schools class. A knock on the door. Yeah.
Any final questions or comments anybody has before we offer our thanks? I think we want to say thanks to Susan too for all the work that you've done, that you do continuously for the gardens, but that you've done with these new gardens in particular. And you mentioned before, I think, that there are some plaques that are going to be made to identify the plants, and then we'll have to
Yeah,
look about
yeah,
after
my
getting
sister-in-law. Mhm.
your sister-in-law. Yeah, and we'll have to think about some kind of larger signage, naming it as the
Yeah.
Garden of Reconciliation. So we'll work on that too.
Sounds good.
Thanks so much for your time, Karen, and for lending your expertise. Thanks for your mother and your son.
Yep.
They're
Mhm.
both blessings to us as well. And your daughter, of course, has been involved in the past with Rhyme and Storytime programming. So-
Yeah, she would love to come back, but you know, I mean, things being what they are, right?
Exactly. So any final words, Susan?
Oh, just thank you. And I have more ideas. Thank you, even just today. So next time I do something, I'll talk to you.
Okay.
More ideas for more planting, you mean?
More, yes, yeah, for next year.
Gardens. Okay.
Sounds
right.
good.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, everybody else.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
It was
Bye.
great. We'll see ya.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Harrow Super Sharing.